Good evening, barflies and lounge lizards, and tonight we'll be taking a look at 5 of my favorite Ed Wood films. But if you're looking for one of those snarky, kind of sarcastic things making fun of Ed's work, this will not be the video for you. And number 5 on the list is Orgy of the Dead from 1965. This one is actually one of my absolute favorites, high up in the list, but since Ed didn't actually direct it, I'm putting it a bit lower. Though he did write it, cast it, was production manager, assistant directed, and even held up the cue cards for Criswell. But Orgy of the Dead tells the story of a young couple who, after a car wreck, find themselves in a graveyard watching as the mysterious entity known as the Emperor, played by the great Criswell of Plan 9 from Outer Space fame, makes the souls of scantily clad women dance for him. And if he isn't pleased, they are sent to damnation. Now, this isn't a traditional film and only has a slight amount of narrative and plot. It is more so a series of connected burlesque performances and stripteases. But what makes it stand out so much is the visuals and the fantastic music. This is one of the best scores I have ever heard in a film, so much so that halfway through watching it for the first time I had to pause the movie and run look online to see if the soundtrack was available for sale. It's almost like watching the coolest music video ever made. It's also a really quirky movie when the actual plot parts are happening. There's this random werewolf and mummy that hang out in the graveyard offering some comic relief. And then there's Criswell. For some reason, he didn't learn his lines, so he just read them off the cue cards, and you can definitely tell. Apparently, since he wasn't wearing his glasses, he was having a hard time reading said cards. His consort in the film, the Black Ghoul, was a role supposedly meant for Vampira, but in the end it was played by Fawn Silver, who I actually ended up liking more. This one is a treat for the eyes and ears. Just go in with the mindset of watching a spooky burlesque show or a long-form music video, and you will have a good time, and that is more than a fact. And number 4 on the list is Final Curtain from 1957. And this one is an even odder case than Orgy of the Dead, so bear with me here. It'll make sense. Kinda. But Final Curtain isn't actually a film, but instead a television pilot written and directed by Ed for a proposed series called Portraits of Terror. It was essentially going to be an anthology series in the vein of The Twilight Zone. For many years, this was a lost film until it was discovered by the nephew of Wood regular Paul Marco. Now, Final Curtain itself tells the story of a man wandering around an empty theater, increasingly freaking himself out with his spooky inner monologue, which was provided by Dudley Manlove, another Wood regular who I've discussed on this very channel before. The actual actor in the scene, Duke Moore, never actually speaks. So some of you may be thinking, well, this doesn't sound too engaging, a guy walking around a theater house thinking, and I cannot fault you there, but I go into this one in a different way. I found it best to approach Final Curtain like a radio play, listen to it rather than watch, because this is a perfect example of how talented a writer Ed actually was. And since the narrative narrates the character's every move, the visuals are not needed. So just sit back in a dark room or listen during a late night walk or drive home and let your imagination create the imagery. It's really quite spooky and Manlove's frantic performance is top notch. All that said though, there's nothing wrong with the actual visual direction or Duke Moore's performance. It's just the visual aspect is simply not needed here. It's much like a Lovecraft story in that what you don't see is what's truly scary. And speaking of the footage, if you just want to see it, much of it was reused and edited into another of Ed's lost but eventually found films, Night of the Ghouls, in a much more effective manner. So if you like radio plays or things of that nature, this is a great one to just sit back and listen to. And number 3 on the list is The Sinister Urge from 1960. And I would argue that this is actually Ed's best film from a technical standpoint. It's one that if his name wasn't attached to it, it would have a very different reputation and would be viewed quite differently. It also has the most to say, with not only some social commentary about a world Ed would soon be entering himself, but also a bit of self-reflection. Written, directed, and co-produced by Ed, The Sinister Urge is a crime drama that tells the story of a rash of murdered young women who all happen to have a connection to an underground adult film racket with mob connections. Many claim that this film is a statement against adult films. That wasn't my takeaway at all. I saw it more as a clever mockery of the attitude that erotic materials lead to violence or deviant behavior. Or at very least, Ed was setting out to make an exploitation film, something to titillate and shock. I cannot by any stretch of the imagination believe that Ed was actually against this kind of content at the time. But hey, what do I know? I'm just a sleazy tiki weirdo in a sleazy tiki world. The film stars several Wood alums such as Keen Duncan, who was in Night of the Ghouls, Duke Moore from the previously mentioned Final Curtain. Remember when I talked about that a few minutes ago in this episode? You know, the Ed Wood one? And Conrad Brooks from Plan 9 from Outer Space, and most importantly, the Fred Olen Ray classic Bikini Drive-In. The Sinister Urge would end up being Ed's sorta last mainstream film and had a budget of around $20,000. It's often called a roughie, which is a subgenre of exploitation film inspired by Psycho. And on that, we should take some kind of break.
You can never tell what's in the dark shadows or what lurks behind each door. But with groovy horror heads for friends, you won't be scared anymore. There's Barnabas and Quentin and the Witch, like in Dark Shadows on TV. They make great decorations for your room. They're so soft and cuddly. Barnabas, Quentin, and the Witch. Get your Dark Shadow horror heads today. They're fun to play with, too. They're all made by Sensible Toys, who make lots of stuffed things for you.
And number 2 on the list is Plan 9 from Outer Space from 1957. And I know what you're thinking. Sterling, you magnificent bastard, how is this not number 1 on the list? Well, as great a film as it is, there is one that I like slightly better. But we'll get to that in a minute. But Plan 9 from Outer Space is Ed's sci-fi epic of infamy. It's the classic tale of aliens raising the dead in order to stop humans from building a doomsday weapon. And yeah, it's low budget with makeshift effects, but it's a highly imaginative and creative film and just downright entertaining, with strange dialogue, memorable performances, and great bits of atmosphere and mood. Now if you're watching this, I assume you already know the film, so I'm just going to skip straight to trivia. Detractors of Ed's work always make the same claim that the flying saucers in the film are either paper plates or hubcaps. Neither is true. In actuality, they were flying saucer model kits released by the Lindbergh Model Company. In the original kit, though, the dome was transparent and there was a little green man inside, but Ed and company painted the entire thing silver. According to Harry Thomas, the film's uncredited makeup artist, he originally planned for the aliens to be much more alien in appearance, including rubber chins and cat-eye contact lenses. But Ed felt there simply wasn't enough time for the process each day, so the idea was scrapped. And speaking of merchandising, which it wasn't, there was a video game released in 1992 for the Amiga and the Atari ST. It was a point-and-click adventure and actually came with a VHS tape of the film. Interesting thing about the plot of the game, it's not an adaptation of the film, and it's about Bella's double, which by double I assume they mean Tom Mason, who has stolen the film itself, and the player must track down the missing reels. And finally, the cape worn by Bella in the movie was from his personal collection. It was one of the ones he wore during his Dracula stage show days. And number 1 on the list, Bride of the Monster from 1955. Originally known as Bride of the Atom, Bride of the Monster is a sci-fi mad scientist kind of picture directed, produced, and co-written by Ed. And it tells the story of a scientist, brilliantly played by Bela Lugosi, with some pretty big plans. This really is Ed's finest work in my sleazy tiki opinion. Great mood, great atmosphere, and again, some great performances. As I mentioned, Bela gives one of the finest of his career. It also happens to be his final speaking role in a film. Kind of a nice swan song for those that can look past the film's unfair reputation. Bride of the Monster featured heavily in the 1994 Ed Wood biopic by Tim Burton, though in the film it's definitely an exaggerated take just to make it seem funny. Nevertheless, the Tim Burton film is still quite good and does capture the essence of Ed nicely. Now, a little known fact is that Bride of the Monster had a direct sequel, Night of the Ghouls, a film that was considered lost for many years and was finally released to home video in 1984 by a fan that managed to locate it and take ownership. It features the return of Tor Johnson's Lobo character, as well as Paul Marco's Kelton, who appeared in Plan 9 from Outer Space. So it's interesting that there was this little 3-film Ed Wood universe going on. This one almost made the list, but Final Curtain just nudged it out just right at the end. But Night of the Ghouls is worth checking out as well. And that's all the time we have for this week. Please like, comment, subscribe, and keep it wacky.